They laughed the moment they walked inside, because nothing about the place looked like a prison. Not the clean tables, not the hot food already waiting in metal trays, and not the quiet way the guards simply stood back and let them move forward. And for a few seconds it almost felt like a mistake, like they had been sent to the wrong building. Until a tray suddenly crashed to the floor, a chair snapped backward, and one of them hit the ground hard in the middle of the room. And in that exact moment, every voice stopped, every movement froze, and instead of shouting or punishment, the guard stepped in calmly. The staff brought a fresh tray, and the meal continued as if nothing had broken. And that was the first time they realized something here did not follow the rules they thought they understood. The truck stopped outside the mess hall just before noon, and the German prisoners climbed down in a loose line, brushing dust from their sleeves and staring at the long wooden building with its painted sign and wide glass windows. It looked less like an army kitchen and more like a school canteen, and that alone made several men smirk before they even reached the door. A corporal at the front stepped inside first, picked up a metal tray, and snorted when he saw the rails, the steam tables, and the women in white aprons moving behind shining pans. Two prisoners behind him laughed out loud, muttered that Americans had built a restaurant for captured men, and tapped their trays as if mocking the neat order of the line. The guards said nothing. They only pointed forward. The prisoners shuffled along the counter and watched thick soup being ladled into bowls, bread dropped beside it, boiled vegetables arranged in sections, and slices of meat placed with almost theatrical care. One man raised his eyebrows at the portions, then grinned and whispered something that made the next three men chuckle again. At the drink station, the joking grew louder. The prisoners found pitchers of milk and rows of cups instead of tin canteens filled by a cook with a dented ladle. One man lifted a cup, held it like a glass in a hotel, and bowed toward another table. Several others laughed with him, drawing looks from American kitchen workers who kept moving without comment. They sat in groups and began eating with that same careless amusement, breaking bread, poking the vegetables, and comparing the meal to camp food back in Europe. A few imitated waiters. One man drummed his spoon on the tray. Another leaned back, chewing slowly, and announced to his table that perhaps captivity in America had the manners of a boarding school. Halfway through the meal, a crash cut across the room. A prisoner near the far wall had kicked one leg of his chair aside while laughing, tipped backward, and struck the floor hard enough to scatter his tray. Soup spread under the table, the cup rolled into the aisle, and the room stopped in a single sharp pause. Two guards moved at once, but not toward punishment. They lifted the man by the arms, set him straight, and called for a medic who entered from a side door with a cloth and a small case. While the medic checked the back of the prisoner's head, two American women from the serving line came out with mops and fresh towels and cleaned the floor around his boots. The injured man tried to wave them off, embarrassed now, but one of the kitchen women set a new tray in front of him as if replacing a dropped lunch at a factory. Fresh soup, fresh bread, fresh meat, and another cup of milk appeared within a minute. The laughter did not return. Men who had been grinning a moment earlier stared down at their own trays. When the meal ended, the prisoners stood and filed toward the exit more quietly than they had entered. Near the door, they passed a board listing tomorrow's menu in chalk, and several slowed to read it without speaking. The jokes had carried them in, but they left the building looking back through the windows at the serving line as if they had missed the point of the room the first time. Are you enjoying this deep dive? Most people don't know this side of the war. If you're one of the few who values true history, subscribe now and help us grow this archive. The next morning, the camp detail returned to the same mess hall for breakfast, but the mood had changed before the first tray left the stack. The men no longer joked at the door. They took their places in line, watched the cooks move between kettles and griddles, and noticed things they had ignored the day before: clean aprons, polished counters, full bins of bread, and a clock that matched the opening of the doors to the minute. Breakfast came in quick order. Eggs slid onto trays, sausage followed, then fried potatoes, jam, oats, and coffee poured from silver urns. The line moved with practiced speed, and every tray looked almost identical when it reached the end. One prisoner near the front stopped to compare 3 servings and found no missing piece, no larger share, no special portion hidden for guards. At the tables, a new event drew everyone's eyes. 2 American workers rolled in a cart loaded with extra bread, fruit, and small paper slips. A guard read the slips aloud in broken German and simple English. Any prisoner assigned to heavy labor outside the fence could take an added ration before departure. Men who had once expected random hunger now had their names checked against work details and received more food by rule. That afternoon, the prisoners marched to a supply shed instead of back to their barracks. Inside, camp staff issued each man a metal knife, fork, and spoon wrapped in cloth, then tagged the bundles with numbers linked to their names. It was not a gift and not trust without limit. The utensils had to be returned after each meal, counted, washed, and inspected, but they were issued through a system rather than thrown into a common box. At supper, another surprise waited. The cook halted the line after a steam valve failed under one of the pans, and a section of potatoes went cold before the final group reached the counter. Rather than wave the last men through, the kitchen shut the line for 10 minutes, reheated the batch, and served the delayed section fresh. The prisoners at the rear, who had braced for scraps, received the same hot portions as the first table. A dispute broke out anyway when one prisoner claimed an American server had shorted him a slice of meat. Instead of shouting him down, the head cook lifted the serving fork, held both slices in open view, and called over the camp interpreter. The portions were weighed on a small scale kept beside the bread cutter. The first slice proved light. The cook replaced it at once and marked the pan for correction. The scale changed the room more than the extra meat. Prisoners stood in line the next day watching the counter with different eyes, seeing measure marks, ration cards, and written schedules where they had first seen soft civilian comfort. The cafeteria was not merely generous. It was organized, watched, and repeated the same way from one meal to the next, as if feeding men well was part of the machinery of the camp. By the end of the week, the laughter had disappeared entirely. In its place came a habit that none of them had brought into the building on the first day. Men entered, lifted trays, and glanced toward the chalkboard before joining the line. They wanted to know the menu, the order, and the time of the next meal, because the room had stopped being a joke and become the one place in camp where promises were posted and then kept. On Friday, the routine broke again, this time with a smell that reached the barracks before the prisoners even formed up. Sweet steam drifted over the yard, mixed with baked bread and roasting meat, and heads turned toward the mess hall long before the guards gave the order to march. Men who had learned the daily pattern could tell at once that this was not the usual lunch. Inside, the serving line had been changed. White cloth covered one side table near the wall, trays of pies rested on raised racks, and bowls of apples stood where empty space had been left on ordinary days. The prisoners moved more slowly now, not from mockery but from open attention, trying to see every pan before they reached it. Even the kitchen workers seemed brisker, as if preparing for inspection. The meal came in stages. First turkey slices under gravy, then mashed potatoes, carrots, beans, bread with butter already cut, and finally a scoop of cranberry sauce that many prisoners stared at before moving on. At the end of the rail, each man received a square of pumpkin pie. Several stopped there, unable to fit everything on the tray without using both hands. At the tables, the first bites brought no loud reaction, only a room full of small pauses. Men ate the meat, then tasted the sweet sauce, then the pie. One prisoner who had joked the loudest on the first day set down his fork, picked up the pie tin, and scraped the corners clean with a care he would once have mocked in another man. Across from him, another tore his bread in half and saved it for the last of the gravy. Then the final group from an outside lumber detail entered late, boots dirty and jackets wet from work beyond the fence. The line had nearly emptied by then, yet the kitchen had held back full portions under lids. Fresh coffee was poured, clean trays were set down, and the pie table was opened again. No one at the labor tables received a thinner plate because he arrived last. A new development followed the meal. The head cook stepped into the aisle with the interpreter and announced that leftover bread from special dinners could be taken to the barracks only if counted and recorded by room. At once a queue formed beside a notebook on a small desk. Prisoners gave barrack numbers, received wrapped slices, and signed with pencil marks or initials. Food moved out, but through procedure, not favor. That evening, the wrapped bread changed the barracks more than the turkey had changed the meal. Men who had spent months hiding crusts in pockets now laid the slices on blankets in plain view, dividing them by bed and by name. No one rushed. No one grabbed. The notebook at the cafeteria door had followed them into the room like a second guard, except it worked through order instead of fear. Later, one prisoner took from his kit a folded photograph from home and placed it beside the remaining piece of bread before turning in for the night. Others noticed and did the same with letters, small prayer books, or pay book covers, setting personal items near food that would still be there in the morning. The meal had not made the camp home, but it had done something visible. It had allowed men to stop eating as if the next plate would vanish. When reveille sounded the next day, a few prisoners still had part of the saved bread left on their blankets. Guards entered, counted heads, and moved on without seizing a single piece. That simple continuation, from cafeteria notebook to untouched breakfast bread in the barracks, carried more force than the holiday meal itself. The change was no longer on the tray. It had crossed the yard and entered the rhythm of camp life. The sharpest turn came with a man named Keller, who had kept his scorn longer than the others and used every meal as a stage. He mocked the pie, mocked the posted menus, and mocked the counting system, until one noon he decided to prove that the cafeteria rules were soft enough to bend. While men cleared their trays, he slipped an extra spoon beneath his sleeve and walked toward the return table. He almost made it to the door. A kitchen worker at the wash station checked the numbered cloth bundles, saw one count short, and raised her hand before Keller had crossed the aisle. A guard stopped him, not with a blow or a shout, but with a quiet order to place both hands on the table. The spoon dropped out, clattered on the wood, and drew every eye in the room. The punishment was immediate, yet strange. Keller was not dragged away. Instead, he was assigned for 3 days to the kitchen sanitation crew under guard. That afternoon, he stood in rubber boots beside deep sinks, scraping trays, sorting utensils, and counting each fork, knife, and spoon into metal racks before they passed through boiling water. He learned the numbers by repetition because the work gave him no way around them. On the second day, a delivery truck backed up to the rear door while Keller carried bins to storage. He stopped and watched sacks of flour, cartons of canned fruit, sides of beef, and crates of milk unloaded against a printed invoice clipped to a board. The sergeant in charge checked every item aloud with the storeman, then signed only after the final crate matched the paper count. On the third morning, Keller helped wheel breakfast carts toward the line before dawn. He saw bakers cutting loaves to fixed thickness, cooks leveling scoops so portions stayed even, and a small waste bucket being weighed from the previous meal. Nothing in the room worked by impulse. The abundance that had seemed theatrical from the tables depended on tally sheets, early deliveries, fuel schedules, and constant cleaning. At lunch, a heavier event interrupted the routine. One prisoner from another barrack collapsed near the drink station before reaching his table. Trays rattled, men stood, and for a second the old instinct for chaos flashed through the room. Then the kitchen team moved in the same order Keller had watched behind the sinks. One worker cleared the aisle, one brought water, a medic checked the man, and the head cook halted the line so no crowd gathered. The collapsed prisoner was carried out, and a doctor later reported heat exhaustion from morning labor. The next meal brought a posted adjustment. Extra water barrels at departure, salted food added for outside crews, and a staggered return so the hottest work teams reached shade sooner. The cafeteria did not only feed the camp. It changed procedure after a failure, and the written notice on the wall showed everyone the correction. When Keller returned to the barracks after his final sanitation shift, he brought no jokes with him. He unfolded his sleeves, set his counted utensil bundle by his bunk, and told the nearest men that the room worked because every plate, ladle, crate, and towel had a place before the doors even opened. The remarks spread bed to bed without embellishment, because it came from the one man who had tried to break the system and had been made to see it from underneath. The next evening, Keller entered the cafeteria in silence, took his tray, and moved along the rail without performance. When he reached the return table after supper, he paused, counted his knife, fork, and spoon once with his own fingers, and laid them down in exact order. No speech followed. The action itself was the final break with the first day, and several men behind him copied it before leaving the hall. Winter rain came hard 2 weeks later and turned the parade ground into dark mud before dawn. A transport detail from another camp rolled through the gate near noon, bringing 40 new German prisoners soaked from the road, stiff from travel, and angry before they even saw their barracks. Their trucks stopped beside the mess hall because the yard beyond the kitchen offered the fastest shelter. The newcomers entered in the same mood the first group had carried on its own arrival. They stared at the bright windows, the rails, the posted menu, and the women in aprons, then began throwing remarks down the line. One laughed at the trays. Another called the dining room a theater. A third lifted a cup and made a toast loud enough for the whole front section to hear. This time the old camp prisoners did not join them. They took their places at the tables, ate, and watched. The line moved the way it always moved. Soup came out, roast beef followed, bread was cut, coffee poured, and wet coats began to steam in the heated room. The newcomers kept talking until one slipped on water dripped from his own trousers and sent his tray skidding against a bench. The room paused, but the result was familiar now. A guard helped the man up, a worker wiped the floor, and a replacement tray arrived before the spilled coffee had reached the leg of the next table. Laughter from the transport detail weakened at once. Several newcomers looked around for the punishment that normally followed disorder and found only the continued motion of the line. Then the strongest event of the afternoon unfolded at the side entrance. Because the transport had arrived late, the kitchen should have been short of bread for the last tables. Instead, the head cook opened reserve racks prepared for storm delays, cut fresh slices, and ordered a second pot of soup from the rear stove. Even the final man from the trucks, who entered with mud up to his calves, received a full meal and a dry seat. One of the newcomers sat across from Keller and muttered that the display would end tomorrow. Keller did not argue. He reached into his pocket, took out the small meal card the camp had issued to his barack, and placed it beside the tray. On it were meal times, labor rations, and return rules, already smudged by use. Then he pointed toward the chalkboard listing breakfast for the next morning and said only, "Read it, then come back." The next morning the transport men returned, expecting thinner portions after the trouble of the day before. Instead, they found oatmeal, eggs, bread, and coffee waiting exactly as posted. By supper, they had also received numbered utensil bundles, barack bread entries, and work detail ration slips. The cafeteria did not soften after first impressions. It absorbed them into the same pattern that had already changed the older prisoners. That night, a storm cut the camp power for several minutes during the evening meal. The room went dark except for rain flashes at the windows. Trays stopped, boots scraped, and some of the new men rose halfway from their benches. Then emergency lamps were lit from hooks behind the counter. The cooks continued serving by hand, and hot food kept crossing the rail in yellow light while thunder rolled above the roof. When the current returned, no one laughed. The newcomers were eating quietly, and the older prisoners were no longer watching them. The final proof had come not from a holiday dish or a kind gesture, but from the fact that the meal continued through delay, rain, extra men, spilled trays, and a power failure without breaking its order. What changed everything was not one flavor on a plate. It was the discovery that the next meal would come, and the one after that, exactly the same. By the time the lights came back on, no one was laughing anymore, not even the new prisoners who had walked in mocking the place just hours before, because every tray was still being served, every portion still measured, and every movement still followed the same quiet order. And as they sat there eating in silence, one of them slowly picked up his spoon, looked around the room, and for the first time since arriving, said nothing. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.